I returned to Coldwater Ridge after 21 years with a suitcase, a faded stock certificate, and my father's chilling advice. Be polite. That night, my stepmother closed the door and slapped me across the face. Here, she hissed. Polite means keeping your mouth shut. The next morning, I walked into Halbert and Pike Consulting as their newly hired advisor. They thought I had come back to apologize. I came back to end them. My name is Rowan Whitlow. I am 31 years old, and for the first time in 21 of those years, I was standing on the graveled driveway of the Whitlow house on Astor Hill. The house looked smaller, a caricature of the sun-drenched sanctuary I held in the locked box of my childhood memory. The white paint was no longer brilliant. It was a sick, chalky gray, flaking away in leprous patches to reveal the dark, weeping wood beneath. It looked like a skeleton shedding its skin. The porch, once the stage for my mother's laughter as she tended to her pots of verbena, now sagged with a weary resignation, its boards warped and stained. The air, thick with the dampness of a late autumn evening, carried a scent I recognized with a jolt that was more pain than nostalgia. Wet pine resin and decay. It was the smell of a place that had given up. The front door opened before my knuckles made contact, a slash of jaundiced yellow light cutting across the porch. My father, Grant Whitlow, stood silhouetted against it. He hadn't so much aged as he had been weathered down, eroded by time and pressure into something softer and less defined. His shoulders, which I remembered as broad and capable, were slumped into a permanent apology. His eyes, the same shade of faded denim as my own, flickered over my face before skittering away to a point somewhere over my left shoulder, as if examining a ghost only he could see. His lips, thin and bloodless, compressed into a tight line. It was a grimace of fear, not a welcoming smile. "Be polite, Rowan," he murmured. The words weren't a piece of fatherly advice. They were a plea, a desperate password meant to grant him safe passage through the next few hours. He was begging me to perform a role, to not disturb the fragile, rotten peace he had built over my mother's grave. I stepped over the threshold, the air inside instantly colder, thick with the cloying sweetness of potpourri, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. And there she was, Delia, my stepmother. She was standing by the grand dining table, the one my grandfather had built from a single oak tree. She was lighting a row of tall, cream-colored candles, her movements graceful and reptilian. The flames shivered to life, casting long, dancing shadows that made her face a mask of shifting planes and hollows. A smile, as thin and cold as a razor's edge, played on her lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated ownership. She saw me, her eyes lingering for a moment on the expensive cut of my coat, and the smile tightened. "Rowan, darling," she cooed, her voice like honey laced with crushed glass. "We were beginning to worry." She gestured to the table, and my eyes followed her hand. Next to her place setting, gleaming under the new candlelight, was the silver cake knife. It was an ornate, heavy thing, a family heirloom. She had placed it perfectly parallel to her plate, its polished blade aimed directly at the empty chair that was meant for me. It was not a utensil, it was a reminder, a declaration of who held the power in this house. This was her table, her home, her husband. I was merely a guest, and a temporary one at that. Dinner was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a silent, suffocating opera conducted by Delia. Every clink of silverware against porcelain, every heavy sigh from my father, was a note in her composition. She served a roast that was exquisitely cooked but carved with a surgical precision that felt violent. The conversation she curated was a minefield of pleasantries about the weather, the failing local economy, and the Newtown ordinances, all subjects that required nothing of me but a nod, nothing of my father but a grunt of agreement. He sat between us, a willing prisoner, his gaze fixed on his plate, chewing his food with a slow, methodical rhythm as if counting down the seconds until he could escape. The silence finally fractured when I reached into my bag and placed a single object in the center of the vast oak table, It was a car key, an old, worn brass key for a 1980s model Ford. The plastic head cracked with age. It landed on the polished wood with a soft, definitive click that echoed in the stillness like a gunshot. It was the only thing I had left of my mother, Nora, the key to the car she had been driving the day she died. My father's fork froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes, for the first time all evening, locked onto mine. For a split second, I saw something flicker in their depths, a ghost of grief, a flash of the man he used to be before his spine had been systematically removed. Then, his gaze slid to Delia, and the light went out. Delia's manicured hand, the one not resting near the cake knife, paused on her wine glass. Her smile didn't falter, but it became something sharper, something dangerous. "Such a sentimental child," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the key. "Always clinging to the past. It's a shame you can't let things go. You ruined this family when you were 10, clinging to things that were already gone. It seems you haven't learned a thing." Her words were meant to be a blade, to gut me right there at the table. I was supposed to cry, to scream, to give her the drama she craved, the proof that I was still the broken, volatile child she had painted me as for 2 decades. I did none of those things. I simply watched her. She picked up the bottle of red wine, her movements a fluid, theatrical display of hospitality. "More wine, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. She leaned across the table, the bottle poised over my glass, and then, in a movement so swift and practiced it was almost invisible, she let the bottle tilt just enough for a single drop of crimson to spill onto the white tablecloth. In the manufactured moment of distraction, as she tutted and reached for a napkin, her other hand shot out. The first slap was open-palmed, the sound a dull, flat thud against my cheek. It was brutally efficient, delivered to the soft tissue just below the cheekbone where a bruise wouldn't immediately blossom. The second and third followed in quick succession, precise and controlled. They were not blows of rage, they were transactions, attacks, a reassertion of dominance. My head snapped to the side, the coppery taste of blood instantly filling my mouth. The candlelight wavered, my vision blurring for a second. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard my father's breath. It was a short, sharp huff, the sound of a man watching a car crash he had no intention of preventing. He didn't move. He didn't speak my name. He just stared at the drop of spilled wine on the tablecloth. His jaw clenched. "Don't make a scene, Rowan," he whispered, his voice hoarse with shame. I slowly turned my head back to face them. I took my linen napkin, dabbed delicately at the corner of my mouth, and looked at the small red smear it left behind. I pushed my chair back, not in a scramble, but with a deliberate, measured scrape against the hardwood floor, and stood up. I took exactly 1 step back from the table, creating a space that was both physical and symbolic. I was no longer a participant. I was an observer, an auditor. I looked at Delia, memorizing the faint, triumphant flush on her cheeks. I inhaled, cataloging her scent. It was lavender, her signature, but tonight it was tainted with something else, a faint, sharp, metallic undertone, the smell of victory, the smell of blood. I stored the information away in a cold, quiet file in my mind. A small, tight smile touched my lips. It didn't reach my eyes. My eyes were busy calculating, processing, recording. "Rest assured," I said, my voice perfectly level, each word a carefully placed stone. "I won't make it big. I'll make it right." Delia's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features for the first time. My father finally looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. They had expected tears. They had prepared for a storm. They had no contingency for the dead, calm sea that now confronted them. Later that night, long after the pretense of family had been put away, and the house had fallen into a strained, watchful silence, I stood in the darkness of the upstairs hallway. The only light was the cold, blue glow of my phone's screen. My fingers moved quickly, tapping out a short, encrypted message to a former colleague, a man who owed me more than one favor and whose skills in forensic accounting were second only to mine. Target location confirmed. Initiate Phase 1. I hit send. The message disappeared into the ether, a digital ghost on its way to start a war. They thought this was a homecoming. They thought they had won. They were wrong. This wasn't a return. It was an audit, and I was here to balance the books. The taste of blood in my mouth was an anchor, a metallic point of focus in the suffocating silence of my childhood bedroom. The room had been preserved, but not out of sentiment. It was a museum exhibit titled The Ungrateful Daughter, left untouched to prove a point. My books were still on the shelf. The posters were still on the wall. But a thin, even layer of dust coated everything, a testament to its irrelevance. Delia hadn't erased me. She had simply allowed time to bury me. From the window, I could see the distant, dark expanse of water that glittered under the moon. They called it Delia's Cove now. That was the first and most public desecration. My mother, Nora, died when I was 10. The official story was clean, tragic, and irrefutable. A sudden summer squall had swept over Coldwater Ridge. The road that hugged the reservoir became slick with rain and fallen leaves. Her car, a heavy old Ford, lost traction on a curve and slid gracefully, almost gently, into the deep, cold water. An accident. A terrible, terrible accident. The town mourned for a respectable month. My father, Grant, became a figure of profound public sympathy, the handsome, heartbroken widower, left alone with his difficult, grieving daughter. The reservoir, the site of this tragedy, had been a place of life. Nora had taught me to skip stones across its surface, her laughter echoing off the pines. We had picnicked on its shores. After she died, it became a wound on the landscape, a place people avoided, until Delia, with her civic-minded benevolence, suggested that renaming it would help the community heal. It would transform a place of sorrow into a symbol of resilience. And what better name than that of the woman who had so selflessly stepped in to help a broken family? The town council, charmed and grateful, agreed unanimously, and just like that, the last place my mother had been alive was rebranded in the name of the woman who replaced her. The water didn't just hold her car, it held her stolen name. Delia arrived exactly 2 months after the funeral. Not a day sooner, not a day later. The timing was impeccable, calibrated for maximum public approval. She didn't arrive as a suitor, but as a concerned friend, a pillar of the community offering solace. She brought with her a quiet, watchful son named Wade and endless casseroles. She brought a smile that was a masterwork of sympathetic sorrow. She was, in the town's adoring eyes, a savior, a selfless soul come to rescue the poor, lonely Grant Whitlow from the clutches of his grief. I saw it for what it was, an acquisition, a leveraged buyout of a vulnerable company. My father, hollowed out and lost, was easy prey. Within 6 months, Delia's touch was everywhere. Nora's bright, floral curtains were replaced with heavy, dark drapes. Her worn, comfortable armchair disappeared, replaced by a stiff, antique settee no one ever sat on. And then came the paperwork. I remember one evening, I came downstairs for a glass of water and saw them at the kitchen table, their heads bent together under the low-hanging lamp. A stack of legal documents sat between them. Delia's hand was on my father's shoulder, her thumb rubbing slow, soothing circles. He was signing, page after page. His expression was one of profound relief, the look of a man gratefully relinquishing a burden. He was signing away deeds, transferring assets, creating joint accounts. He was handing her the keys to the kingdom. From that day on, all mail that came to the house, bank statements, bills, letters, was opened by Delia first. She called it helping him manage the stress. I called it seizing control of the information. She became the gatekeeper to my father's life. With her position secured, the final piece of Nora's legacy had to be dealt with. Me. I was an inconvenient artifact, a living reminder of the previous administration, so I was sent away. New Rook Academy was a respectable, distant boarding school, the kind of place people sent children who needed structure. It was the perfect, publicly acceptable way to put me in storage. The first holiday break, I packed my bags and waited in the empty dormitory, watching other children run into the arms of their laughing parents. No one came. A curt phone call from Delia to the headmaster explained that there had been a family emergency. I spent Christmas with the janitor's family. The pattern was set. I was forgotten during Thanksgiving, Easter, and every summer vacation. It wasn't cruel. Delia would have explained to anyone who asked. It was for my own good. I was a troubled child, she would say, her voice laced with pity. I was struggling with the loss of my mother, acting out, prone to telling wild, fanciful stories. The town, which saw only her serene smile and my father's slow return to life, nodded and believed. They repeated her words until they became a local creed. Rowan Whitlow, that poor, troubled girl. Her father and his new wife have their hands full. The narrative was her greatest weapon. It isolated me, discredited me before I could even speak. A lie, told often enough, becomes a landmark. So I stopped trying to speak. I channeled my rage, my grief, my searing sense of injustice into a single, cold purpose. I excelled at New Rook, not for them, but for me. I chose my path with the precision of a sniper. I went to Mason Ridge College and majored in forensic accounting. Other students were driven by ambition or passion. I was driven by the certain knowledge that the truth wasn't in stories, but in numbers. Numbers don't lie. They don't have emotions. They can be hidden, manipulated, and disguised. But if you know how to look, they will always, eventually, tell you what really happened. I learned to read ledgers like novels, to find the narrative in a string of transactions. I took a job at a top firm in the city, working on complex fraud cases. I buried myself in the work, becoming a ghost in my own life. I built a wall of professional success and emotional detachment between myself and Coldwater Ridge. I did not look back. For 21 years, I did not look back. Then, 4 months ago, the past came for me. It arrived at my sterile glass and steel apartment in a plain oilskin envelope with no return address. My name and address were typed on a slip of paper and taped to the front. Inside, there was no letter, just a small stack of documents. The first was a series of photocopied invoices from a company I'd never heard of. Astor Municipal Services, billing the town of Coldwater Ridge for emergency reservoir maintenance. The dates were recent. The amounts were large, round, and recurring. The second was a set of grainy screenshots from what looked like a private social media group, showing Delia clinking champagne glasses with a man I vaguely recognized as one of the town's more influential business owners. The third and final document was a consulting contract. It was between the town of Coldwater Ridge and a firm called Halberd and Pike. The firm was being hired to optimize municipal budgets and identify cost-saving opportunities. The signature on the contract, approving the engagement on behalf of the town, was Delia Whitlow, in her capacity as the newly appointed interim town treasurer. At the very bottom of the contract, a single line was handwritten in shaky, block letters. It wasn't a signature, but a mission statement. Someone who owes your mother the truth. I stood there in my silent apartment, the city lights painting sterile patterns on the floor, and I held the pieces in my hand. It was no longer just a collection of painful memories and half-formed suspicions. It was a map. The invoices, the screenshots, the contract. They were the beginning of a trail. For years, I had heard whispers in town gossip about Delia's close relationship with the founders of Halberd and Pike, a powerful regional consulting firm. People said she had a knack for connecting the right people, for making things happen. I had always dismissed it as part of her social climbing, but this was different. This wasn't a rumor whispered over coffee at the local diner. It was a blood vessel, a direct, pulsing artery connecting Delia's civic power to Halberd and Pike's financial interests. And at the center of it all was the reservoir, my mother's reservoir. I finally understood. The battle for my family's soul hadn't ended when I was sent away. It had just gone quiet. Now, it was time to make it loud. My entry into the belly of the beast was not through a forced door, but a welcoming one held open by my stepbrother. Wade, ever the loyal son, had arranged my position at Halberd and Pike. He had pitched it to the partners, and to my father, as a brilliant stroke of familial synergy. "Rowan's a top-tier auditor," he'd argued, his voice oozing with a salesman's sincerity I'd seen him practice in the mirror as a teenager. "The state audit is coming up. Who better to help us prepare, to make sure our work for the town is presented perfectly, than one of our own?" It was a beautiful narrative. The prodigal daughter, returning to the fold, using her skills to protect the family's interests. They bought it completely. They believed I was there to help them bury the body, not to exhume it. The headquarters of Halberd and Pike occupied the top 3 floors of the Amber Line Tower, the only glass and steel skyscraper in the county. It was a monument to manufactured legitimacy. The lobby was a cavern of polished concrete and brushed steel, cold and resonant. The firm's logo, a stylized H&P intertwined like 2 silver snakes, was mounted on a vast gray wall, gleaming under a series of spotlights. It wasn't a sign. It was an altar. The air was sterile, filtered, and smelled of nothing at all, which was somehow more unsettling than the scent of decay at my father's house. This was a place where unpleasant realities were scrubbed from existence. A junior associate with an anxious smile and a tie that was too tight escorted me to a temporary workspace, a glass-walled cubicle they called a visiting consultant suite. It overlooked the town square, offering a god's-eye view of the world they were so expertly bleeding dry. Wade met me there, clapping me on the shoulder with a bonhomie that felt like a physical assault. "Welcome aboard, sis," he said, grinning. "The team is thrilled to have your eyes on this. We just want to make sure everything is buttoned up, a fresh perspective, you know?" "Of course," I replied, my voice calibrated to a perfect, neutral monotone. "I'll need system access to review the municipal engagement files and the corresponding general ledger entries." "Anything you need," he said expansively. I made my first move, a subtle test of their arrogance. "Read-only access is standard for an initial review. I can start there." It was a gesture of deference, the request of someone who knew her place, someone who wouldn't be digging too deep. Wade waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be silly. You're not just some contractor. You're family. We trust you. It will give you full right access, you know, in case you see any inconsistencies that need to be tidied up before the state guys get here." He winked. It was a conspiratorial gesture, a welcome into their club of thieves. It was also their first critical error. They had just handed me the scalpel. Once the anxious IT tech had set up my credentials and scurried away, I logged in. The accounting software was a standard enterprise system, but the data within it was anything but. It was like looking at a meticulously crafted lie. On the surface, everything appeared clean, but to a forensic accountant, the patterns screamed. The first red flag was the round numbers. Legitimate business transactions are messy. They end in odd cents and uneven figures. The payments from the town's emergency maintenance fund to various shell corporations were all in clean. Round thousands. $50,000, $75,000, $120,000. It was the financial equivalent of a murderer neatly wiping down the crime scene, but forgetting to wash the blood from under his fingernails. The second flag was the timestamps. I filtered the journal entries by posting time, a cluster of transactions, all described as provisional adjustments or contingency fund reconciliations, had been posted between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m. on the last day of each quarter. This wasn't accounting. It was a ghost shift. A deliberate act of manipulation performed when the fewest eyes would be watching. The fraud wasn't just happening, it was scheduled. I began to trace the flow of capital, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The path was deliberately convoluted, designed to frustrate a cursory audit. It started with the official town budget. As per the optimization plan designed by Halberd and Pike, the annual funding for the Nora Whitlow Memorial Reservoir had been slashed by 70%. Those funds were then reappropriated to the newly created Coldwater Ridge Emergency Maintenance Fund. The approving official for this transfer, the signature on the digital authorization form, was my stepmother, Delia Whitlow, interim town treasurer. From that emergency fund, the money was dispersed in those clean, round-numbered payments to a web of newly formed LLCs with opaque names like Ridge Infrastructure Solutions and Astor Logistics. These companies had no websites, no physical addresses, and no employees. They were digital ghosts, created for the sole purpose of receiving money. After aging in those accounts for a few days, the funds were then consolidated and transferred one final time. The final destination was an account belonging to a nonprofit organization. It was a registered charity, which gave it a veneer of respectability and certain tax advantages. The name of the charity was the Haven of Astor. I ran a quick public records search. The foundation's stated purpose was promoting community beautification and civic wellness in Coldwater Ridge. Its honorary chairwoman, whose smiling face graced the top of the organization's single-page website, was Delia. She wasn't just a beneficiary of the fraud. She was its public face, cloaked in the sacred robes of philanthropy. Now that I had the map, I had to secure the evidence before they knew I was looking. Granting me right access was their mistake. My use of it would be their undoing. I couldn't alter their files. They would see that immediately. But I could create a perfect secret witness. I connected my encrypted drive and executed a script I had written years ago for a particularly nasty corporate espionage case. It was a silent, voracious little piece of code. It attached itself to the system's core audit log and began creating a shadow ledger, a real-time, second-by-second copy of every single action taken within the system, every keystroke, every deleted file, every altered number, from this moment forward, would be duplicated and streamed to a secure, off-site server under my control. They could burn their books, but I would have the ashes, perfectly preserved. With my digital trap set, I turned to the human element. Numbers show what happened, but they don't always show intent. For that, you need people to get careless. I navigated to the company's internal communications server. My consultant access was surprisingly permissive. I found what I was looking for in minutes. A private group chat. Its name was The Garden Party. The conversation history was a cesspool of arrogance. There were smug jokes about the town council, disparaging comments about local business owners, and self-congratulatory toasts to their own cleverness. I scrolled back 3 months, to the date the anonymous package was postmarked. And there it was, a photo, uploaded by Victor Pike, the firm's senior partner. It was the same picture I had received. Delia, holding a champagne flute high, her face alight with triumphant glee, surrounded by the firm's leadership, but here, the photo had a caption. It was a message from Victor to the group, a little inside joke for the architects of the scam. It read, "A toast to a very cooperative reservoir." I took a screenshot. I exported the chat log. I saved it all to my encrypted drive. This was the final piece. This wasn't just a financial crime anymore. This was a desecration. They weren't just stealing money. They were laughing about it, raising a glass to the memory of the woman whose death had made it all possible. They had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led directly from the town's coffers to their champagne flutes. And they had been arrogant enough to believe that no one would ever be able to follow it. But I wasn't just anyone. I was Nora's daughter, and I was just getting started. That night, after the sterile, air-conditioned chill of Halbert and Pike, I returned to the oppressive silence of the house on Astor Hill. Delia and my father were out, attending some civic function where she would be celebrated and he would stand beside her, a handsome, vacant prop. The emptiness of the house was a relief. It was in the silence that I could finally hear the past. I went to the attic, a place Delia never ventured, claiming a dust allergy that was as fabricated as her concern for my father. In the far corner, under a canvas sheet yellowed with age, was my mother's old hope chest. It was made of oak, the same deep, honest wood as the dining table downstairs. But this piece felt different. It was warm to the touch, imbued with a latent energy, The lock was simple, a small brass fitting that had long since lost its key, but I had the only one that mattered. I took out the worn Ford key, the one I had placed on the table like a thrown gauntlet. I slid its tip into the lock. It was not a perfect fit, but after a moment of gentle pressure, I felt the tumbler shift with a soft, metallic sigh. The lid lifted, releasing the scent of my childhood, cedar, dried lavender, and the faint, papery smell of time itself. The contents were not a curated collection of memories. They were an arsenal, waiting for an heir. On top lay a small, black cassette tape, the kind used in micro-recorders, its label blank. Beneath it was a folded sheaf of papers held together with a rusted paperclip, and at the very bottom, a single, unsealed envelope containing a half-finished letter. These were my mother's last effects, the things she had deemed important enough to hide just before she died. I took the items back to my room and closed the door. I had brought a portable cassette player with me, a relic I'd purchased from a vintage electronics store for this exact purpose. With trembling hands, I inserted the tape and put on my headphones. I pressed play. The sound was distorted, muffled by background noise, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug, the distant drone of a lawnmower. But then came the voices, sharp and clear. The first was my mother's, tight with an anger I had never heard from her in life. It was a controlled fury, the sound of a woman pushed past her limit. "Immoral, and you know it is," Nora said. "You can't just cut the primary drainage route to save on construction fees. The geological survey was clear. The pressure on the southern retaining wall will be too great during a heavy rain." Then, the second voice, it was female, smoother than my mother's, laced with a patronizing calm. It was a voice that dismissed concerns, that patted them on the head like a fretful child. "Nora, darling, you're being dramatic. It's a cost-saving measure. It's perfectly standard. We're simply redirecting the overflow. It's efficient." "It's reckless," my mother snapped back. "If that valve fails, the whole basin will overtop the road in minutes. You're putting people at risk to protect your profit margin." The other voice laughed, a dry, dismissive little sound. "That's what insurance is for. It's been handled. Don't worry your pretty little head about it." The recording ended with the sharp click of the stop button. My mother's last argument, her last stand. I rewound the tape and listened again. Then a third time, isolating the second voice. It was familiar. A ghost of a cadence I knew, but 21 years had warped the memory. I needed to be certain. Next, I unfolded the papers. They were receipts and work orders. The most significant was a carbon copy of a purchase order from a defunct industrial supply company. It was for a dozen surplus-grade pressure release valves. The purchase date was 2 weeks before the accident. The delivery address was a town maintenance yard near the reservoir, and the signature on the receiving line, a spiky, arrogant scrawl, was for W. Halberd. Willard Halberd, the founder of Halberd and Pike, long since retired. The connection wasn't just a consulting contract. It was buried in the concrete and steel of the reservoir itself. They hadn't just engineered a financial scheme, they'd engineered a disaster. Finally, I picked up the letter, my mother's handwriting, a graceful, looping cursive, filled half a page. "My dearest Rowan," it began, "I hope you never have to read this. I hope I am being foolish and paranoid, and that I can burn this letter tomorrow and laugh about it, but I feel like the whole world has tilted on its axis lately. People I thought were friends now look at me with cold eyes. Grant is distant. He listens to others now. If you are reading this, it means someone has stopped pretending. It means my worrying wasn't for nothing. Know this, my love. Whatever happens, whatever they say about me, the truth is in the numbers. Always look at the numbers, and never, ever let them make you feel small." The letter stopped there, an unfinished thought from an unfinished life. She had known. She had felt the net closing around her. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold, calculated action. I digitized the cassette tape, using professional software to clean the audio, stripping away the background hiss and isolating the two voices. Then, I accessed the public archives of the Coldwater Ridge Church. They had digitized their old wedding videos years ago as part of a preservation project. I found the one I was looking for, the wedding of Grant Whitlow and Delia Thorne. I fast-forwarded to the vows. I isolated the audio of Delia saying, "I do." I fed both voice samples, the one from the tape and the one from the wedding, into a biometric analysis program. The software broke down the pitch, the timbre, the unique cadence of her speech pattern. The result came back in seconds, a 98.7% probability match. It was a near-perfect certainty. The voice on the tape, the one laughing off my mother's safety concerns, belonged to Delia. I compiled everything: the audio file, the voice analysis report, the scanned purchase order signed by Halberd, and my mother's letter, into a single encrypted file. I sent it to a constitutional lawyer I knew in the state capitol, a woman with a reputation for taking on municipal corruption and who had no ties, political or personal, to Coldwater Ridge. My instructions were simple. Hold this file in escrow. Do not act on it until you receive a second public signal from me. My next step was to secure my legal standing. It wasn't enough to be Nora's daughter. I had to be an injured party in the current scheme. The town was about to issue a new series of municipal bonds to fund infrastructure improvements, including more maintenance around Delia's Cove. Using a blind trust, I purchased a small but significant block of these bonds. When the fraud I was about to expose became public, the value of those bonds would plummet. I would be a defrauded investor, with the legal right to sue the town and its officers, including its interim treasurer, for damages. That evening, I sat in my mother's old sewing room, which Delia had turned into a storage space for out-of-season decorations. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, mothballs, and the ghost of old lavender. The digital evidence was secure. My legal position was fortified. All the pieces were in place. I took out a clean sheet of paper and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote a title: The Audit. Below it, I made 3 columns: who knew, who benefited, who feared. Under the first, I wrote Delia W. Halberd, Victor Pike, Grant Whitlow. The question mark next to my father's name was a deliberate, cold choice. His ignorance was a luxury I could no longer afford to grant him. Under the second, Delia, Halberd and Pike, Wade. Under the third, all of them. The final objective was taking shape, no longer a vague yearning for justice, but a clear strategic goal. This couldn't be a quiet victory, a backroom deal. Their crimes had been committed in the shadows, cloaked in pleasantries and civic-minded rhetoric. My revenge would be executed in the brightest light possible. I would not just expose them, I would make them the star performers in their own downfall, with the entire town of Coldwater Ridge as the audience. The curtain would rise in broad daylight. The meeting was set for the 18th floor. They called it the Summit Room. It was a cube of tempered glass, suspended in the sky, with a panoramic view of Coldwater Ridge sprawling below like a topographical map of their own making. From this height, the reservoir was just a shard of dark blue glass. The polished black granite of the conference table reflected the sky, making it feel as though we were floating, untethered to the world of consequences below. I was the first to arrive, and I used the time to connect my laptop to the room's projector, the quiet click of the cable locking into place echoing in the silent room. They entered together, a phalanx of power. Victor Pike, the firm's CEO, took the head of the table. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from expensive teak, all sharp angles and tanned, unyielding surfaces. My stepbrother, Wade, took the seat to his right, arranging a leather-bound portfolio with an air of self-importance. He was the Dauphin, eager to show his worth. And then Delia. She did not take a seat at the table. Instead, she chose a chair set slightly back, against the glass wall, assuming the position of a royal observer, a queen mother overseeing her son's first council of war. It was a subtle, brilliant move, placing her outside the fray but above it all. She smiled at me, a serene, placid expression that did not touch her eyes. Victor began without preamble. He tented his fingers, his manicured nails gleaming. Rowan, thank you for your preliminary work. We've reviewed your initial assessment. Thorough. The compliment was an anesthetic, meant to numb me before the incision. As you know, the state auditors are due in 2 weeks. We need to ensure that the town's books, specifically the reservoir-related accounts, are presented in the most streamlined fashion. There are a number of contingency fund transfers that could be misconstrued by an unsophisticated eye. We need you to clean them up, make them tidy. He said the word tidy without blinking. His gaze was flat and heavy. A physical pressure. It was a command. Wrapped in the soft tissue of corporate jargon, he was telling me to bury their crimes under a fresh layer of fraudulent bookkeeping. Wade nodded along, a look of smug intelligence on his face. He truly believed I was on his side, the clever sister brought in to sweep the family's dirt under the rug. I took a sip of the iced water that had been provided, the cold glass a steadying presence in my hand. Of course, I said, my voice even. Clarity is always the goal. I've prepared a brief presentation that models the flow of capital. It should help us identify the exact areas that require tidying. I clicked the remote. The wall behind Victor lit up. The first slide was a complex flowchart, a web of arrows and boxes tracking the movement of funds from the Coldwater Ridge municipal budget. It showed the 70% budget cut to the reservoir, the reappropriation to the Emergency Maintenance Fund, and the subsequent disbursement to the network of Shell LLCs. As you can see, I began, my voice taking on the cool, detached tone of a lecturer. The funds follow a multi-stage path. The initial transfers are clustered on the last day of each quarter. The subsequent transfers to the secondary holding companies occur within a 72-hour window. I clicked again. A new slide appeared, showing a scatterplot graph. My analysis shows a transaction pattern that strongly correlates to a structured layering methodology, designed to obscure the ultimate destination of the funds. Wade let out a short, derisive laugh. "Showy," he said, leaning back in his chair and addressing Victor. "Not me. She's always been dramatic. It's a lot of fancy graphics. But the transactions themselves are all properly authorized and documented. It's perfectly legal." "Legal is a matter of interpretation," I said quietly, without looking at him. My eyes were on Victor. "But patterns are a matter of mathematics." I clicked the remote one more time. The flowchart and graphs vanished. The screen was now split into 2 vertical panes. On the right was a crisp, clear data table listing a series of transactions from the Emergency Maintenance Fund to the Haven of Astor charity. The timestamps on each transaction were precise, all falling between 10:00 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. on the evening of the annual Halbert and Pike Company Gala. On the left was a photograph, the garden party photograph. It was Victor and Delia, center frame. Their heads were thrown back in laughter, their champagne flutes held high, caught in the act of a triumphant toast. The joy on their faces was visceral, predatory. The juxtaposition was brutal. On one side, the secret siphoning of public funds. On the other, the public celebration of the thieves. The story was no longer about numbers. It was about faces. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. The low hum of the climate control system suddenly seemed deafening. Wade's smirk dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He looked from the screen to his mother, his brow furrowed. But the real show was Victor Pike. The deep, confident tan seemed to recede from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy substrate. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch, a tiny, frantic drumbeat of panic. Only Delia remained perfectly still. Her smile was fixed in place, an exquisite piece of porcelain artifice. She tilted her head, a gesture of mild curiosity. "Oh, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "It seems the child has misunderstood. That was a charity event. Rowan, we were toasting to a successful fundraising drive. You've confused correlation with causation. It's a common mistake for a junior analyst." She was trying to reframe me, to reduce me back to the troubled child, the girl who told wild, fanciful stories. I didn't answer her. Instead, I closed the presentation and opened a new file on my desktop. It was an audio file, its name a simple string of numbers. I double-clicked. The room's high-fidelity speakers came to life, not with a boom, but with a quiet, scratchy hiss. Then, a woman's voice, smooth and patronizing, filled the silence. Dramatic. It's a cost-saving measure. We're simply redirecting the overflow. I let it play for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of a 21-year-old conversation. Then I hit the spacebar. The voice cut off, but the words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The silence that followed was more damning than any accusation. It was a vacuum, pulling all the composure and confidence out of the room. Delia's smile finally broke. It didn't fall. It shattered. A hairline crack appearing in the flawless mask. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. Victor Pike made a strangled sound in his throat. He reached for his glass of water, but his hand was shaking. His knuckles, wrapped around the crystal tumbler, were bone white. "This meeting," he croaked, his voice a dry rasp, "is on pause. We will reconvene." It was a dismissal, an attempt to regain control, but his voice was thin, brittle. He had lost command of the room. He had lost command of the narrative. I stood up, gathering my things with a slow, deliberate calm. I looked at the three of them, a tableau of dawning horror. They were no longer titans in a glass tower. They were just people in a trap, who had only just heard the snap of the steel. A small, cold smile touched my lips. "There's no need to reconvene," I said, my voice soft but carrying across the vast table. "I have everything I need. I'll be sending my final, unedited report to you and to the state comptroller's office this afternoon." I turned and walked to the door, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm on the polished concrete floor, as the heavy glass door swung silently shut behind me, sealing them in their panoramic prison. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new text message. It was from Wade. "You can come after anyone, but you don't touch my mother." I looked at the message, then back through the glass at the three figures frozen around the table. Wade's threat wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation. He had just told me exactly where the heart of their entire rotten enterprise was, and he had just handed me the knife. The Astor Community Hall smelled of stale coffee, damp wool coats, and decades of simmering small-town resentments. It was a cavernous, wood-paneled room, its walls lined with faded photographs of past mayors and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. This was the civic heart of Coldwater Ridge, a place of bake sales and bingo nights, and tonight, it was a courtroom. The town council was holding a public hearing on the new municipal bond issue, a routine procedure that had suddenly become the hottest ticket in town. I had made sure of that. I sat in the third row, on a hard-folding chair, another anonymous face in a crowd of concerned citizens, farmers in clean plaid shirts, and local business owners. I was not Rowan Whitlow, the prodigal daughter. Tonight, I was R. Whitlow, investor, a name on a bond purchasing agreement. My posture was straight, my hands resting on the portfolio in my lap. I was a study in professional calm. At the front of the room, on a raised dais, sat the town council, and at its center, presiding over the proceedings, was Delia. She was in her element, the picture of serene authority in a sensible navy blue suit. She radiated a calm competence, her smile a carefully calibrated instrument of public trust. When she spoke into the microphone, her voice was smooth and reassuring, the voice of a woman who had everything under control. "And so," she concluded, after a lengthy, jargon-filled presentation on the bond's merits, "these funds will allow us to make critical infrastructure improvements, ensuring the long-term safety and beautification of our community for years to come. The floor is now open for public comment." A few hands went up. An old farmer asked about the impact on his property taxes. A shop owner voiced concerns about the construction timeline. Delia handled each question with practiced ease, her answers a soothing balm of bureaucratic nonsense. Then I stood up. "R. Whitlow," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hall's acoustics. I'm a holder of a preliminary stake in this bond issue. Delia's smile tightened by a barely perceptible millimeter. All eyes turned to me. Of course, Ms. Whitlow, she said. Please, go ahead. Thank you, I said, stepping forward to the public microphone. My questions are purely technical, concerning the allocation of funds within the reservoir maintenance and safety line item. Could you provide details on the specific maintenance being planned? And further, could you elaborate on the status of the secondary and tertiary backup drainage routes for the reservoir, as specified in the original 1978 engineering plans? The room was silent. My questions were dry, technical, and to most people, probably meaningless. But I wasn't speaking to most people. I was speaking directly to her. I saw a flicker in her eyes, a brief, sharp glint of alarm before the mask of public service slid perfectly back into place. An excellent and thorough question, Delia said smoothly, not missing a beat. The maintenance involves routine desilting and structural integrity assessments, all standard protocols. As for the drainage routes, our consultants at Halbert and Pike have assured us that current systems are more than adequate and that a full system redundancy analysis is part of their Phase 2 optimization strategy. We are confident in their expert assessment. It was a perfect non-answer. A cloud of corporate jargon designed to obscure and dismiss. It was exactly what I had expected. Thank you for that clarification, I said. In the interest of complete transparency for myself and other investors, I would like to formally submit a Freedom of Information Act request for all documents pertaining to these maintenance allocations. I walked forward and placed a thick file folder on the town clerk's desk beside the dais. The clerk, a mousy woman named Brenda, looked up at Delia in a panic. My request, I continued, my voice firm and clear, includes all contracts and communications between the town treasurer's office and Halbert and Pike, as well as a complete transaction history for the Coldwater Ridge Emergency Maintenance Fund for the past 24 months. I had attached the full, unedited chain of financial transfers to the back of the official FOA form. It was now a matter of public record. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was no longer a routine hearing. In the corner of the room, a young reporter from the Coldwater Ledger, the local weekly paper, had been dutifully taking notes. Now, I saw him raise his smartphone. A small red light indicated he was live streaming. He panned the phone from me to the dais, capturing Delia's strained expression. The fund you're referring to, I pressed on, turning slightly to ensure the reporter's phone could pick up my voice clearly, appears to be the primary funding source for a local charity called the Haven of Astor. Can you confirm if that is correct? That was the spark. On the reporter's phone screen, I could see the live chat comments scrolling by in a frantic blur. The name of the charity, Delia's pet project, connected so brazenly to a town fund, had lit a fire. Before Delia could respond, a figure shot to his feet in the front row. It was Wade. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes blazing. "This is an outrage," he shouted, pointing a finger at me. "This is a personal attack, a smear campaign based on lies and fabricated documents. She is a disgruntled family member with a personal vendetta, and she is abusing a public forum to slander the name of a dedicated public servant." His outburst was a gift. His emotional, defensive rage was a stark contrast to my cold, procedural inquiry. He wasn't just defending a town treasurer, he was defending his mother, and his panic made it obvious that my questions had hit a nerve. The hall erupted into a cacophony of whispers and shouts. The council chairman banged his gavel. Calling for order, Delia sat frozen behind her microphone, her serene mask finally cracking under the pressure. I held up a hand, and surprisingly, the room quieted. "I am not here to make accusations," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "I am here, as an investor, to ensure due diligence. Mr. Pike's son is correct that these are serious matters. The documents I have submitted raise questions that deserve clear answers." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. I also possess audio evidence that provides critical context to these financial irregularities. However, it is not my wish to present incomplete information. I turned my gaze to the council. Therefore, I formally request a 48-hour continuance of this hearing. This will provide the council with time to review the documents I've submitted and will allow me to prepare my audio evidence in its full, unredacted context for official presentation. The hook was set. The bait was in the water. I hadn't played the tape. I had simply announced its existence. The threat of it was now more powerful than the sound itself. The room buzzed with speculation. A continuance was a reasonable, procedural request. To deny it would look like a cover-up. As the chairman, flustered and overwhelmed, began discussing the motion with the council members, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a new email. The sender's address belonging to Victor Pike. The subject line was blank. The message was 5 words long. Private meeting tonight. Don't overplay. They were terrified, and they were ready to make a deal. I stood there, bathed in the fluorescent lights of the community hall, the eyes of the entire town on me. I typed my reply, my thumb moving with cold precision. I am not overplaying. I am correcting the record. I hit send. The air in the Halbert and Pike sub-basement archives was cold and dead. It smelled of forgotten paper, silverfish, and the slow, inexorable decay of secrets. A single, bare fluorescent bulb hummed overhead, casting a sick greenish light on the rows of steel shelving that stretched into the darkness like the ribs of a leviathan. Boxes of old case files and financial records were stacked to the ceiling. A library of corporate sins. This was where things were sent to be forgotten. It was the perfect place for a burial. They were waiting for me. Victor Pike stood beside a heavy steel table in the center of the room, his expensive suit looking out of place against the raw concrete walls. He looked tired, the confident tan from the boardroom replaced by a sallow, strained pallor. Delia was seated at the table, her hands folded primly in her lap. She looked as composed as ever, but the stillness was different now. It was the stillness of a predator coiled to strike, not one at rest, and guarding the only exit, leaning against the heavy fire door, was Wade. His arms were crossed over his chest, his expression a mixture of adolescent defiance and genuine menace. He was the muscle, the final, thuggish line of defense. I closed the distance, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. I stopped on the opposite side of the table from Victor. No one spoke. The hum of the fluorescent bulb filled the void. Victor broke the silence first. He reached into his jacket and produced a thick manila envelope. It was unstamped, unaddressed, and swollen with its contents. He didn't hand it to me. He placed it on the steel table and slid it across the surface. The sound was a dry, rasping whisper. "There's $250,000 in there," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Cash, non-sequential bills. You take it, you get in your car, and you drive until Coldwater Ridge is a memory. You don't stop. You don't look back. And you delete every file you think you have. You disappear. Tonight." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a termination. They were firing me from their lives, offering a severance package for my silence. I looked at the envelope, then at Victor's hard, expectant face. I didn't move. Delia leaned forward, the fluorescent light catching the cold fire in her eyes. She smiled, a thin, reptilian curve of her lips. She beckoned me closer with a single, manicured finger. I held my ground. So she rose and glided around the table until she was standing right beside me, her presence a cloud of expensive perfume and cold intent. She leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear, her voice a venomous whisper. $250,000 is a very polite way of saying, "Shut up, Rowan, darling," she breathed. "You wanted to be polite. Real politeness is knowing when to make a graceful exit, when to disappear at just the right moment." Her breath was warm on my skin. The lavender scent was back, but this time I could smell the metal underneath. Sharp and clear. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I simply reached into my coat pocket. I brought out a small, sleek device, no bigger than a deck of cards. It was a digital audio recorder. I placed it on the table next to the envelope full of blood money. Wade tensed by the door. Victor's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand," I said, my voice quiet but resonating in the dead air. "This was never about money." I pressed a button on the side of the recorder. A small blue light blinked on. Wade started to move forward, but Victor held up a hand, stopping him. They thought I was about to play the tape, to give them a private screening of their damnation. They were wrong. The device in my hand was a recorder. Yes, but its primary function was something else entirely. It was a shadowcast, a high-frequency tactical transmitter. The blue light didn't mean play, it meant live. It meant that the microphone was active, and every sound in this concrete tomb was being broadcast via a paired receiver I had placed in the wheel well of the Coldwater Ledger reporter's car, parked in the deserted lot directly above us. I looked directly at Delia, whose smug expression was beginning to waver. "Let's clear the record. For posterity," I said, my voice loud and articulate, each word a carefully placed brick. "Mrs. Whitlow, do you confirm that, prior to my mother's death, you participated in a discussion about cost-saving measures for the reservoir, specifically the cutting of the primary drainage route and the installation of substandard pressure release valves?" The sheer, legalistic audacity of the question caught her off guard. She stared at me, and then she laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound that bounced off the concrete walls. It was the laugh of a woman who believed she had already won, who was simply swatting at a fly before enjoying her feast. "Confirm?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with derision. "My dear, I don't confirm anything to you. I discussed saving the town's money, something your idealistic mother could never understand. Call it what you want. It's called good business." It was a confession, born of pure, unadulterated hubris, a public confession. Up above, in the parking lot, I imagined the reporter scrambling to turn up the volume on the small speaker connected to the receiver, his eyes wide. "Thank you for that clarification," I said. Then I pressed another button on the device. This time, a voice filled the room, not mine, not Delia's live voice. It was the ghost. The sound was tinny, warped by 21 years of magnetic decay, but it was unmistakable. "Immoral, and you know it is," said Nora Whitlow. Delia froze, the color draining from her face. "Can't just cut the primary drainage route to save on construction fees," my mother's voice continued, echoing around the room, a clear, damning testament from the grave. Then Delia's voice, younger, sharper. "You're being dramatic. It's a cost-saving measure. It's efficient." The full, unedited recording played on, the argument, the dismissal, the cold, casual disregard for human life in the name of profit. It filled the silence, an irrefutable, 2-minute symphony of motive and intent. When it was over, Wade finally broke. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged forward, his hand outstretched to snatch the device from the table. "I told you not to touch her." He never made it. The heavy fire door swung inward with a deafening crash. Framed in the doorway stood the town's chief of police, a man named Harris, who had a face like a worn leather boot. He was not a hero. He was a bureaucrat with a badge, a man who followed procedure above all else, and my lawyer, acting on my signal, had provided him with a court order that procedure demanded he follow. "Nobody touches anything," Harris said, his voice a flat, unimpressed baritone. He took in the scene, the money, the recorder, the 3 panicked faces. "That device is now evidence in a pending municipal investigation." Delia looked as if she had been turned to stone. Wade stood frozen, his hand hovering over the table. Victor Pike, however, was a pragmatist. He saw the game was over. He turned his back on Delia, on Wade, on all of it, and took a single step toward a side exit I hadn't noticed. He was cutting his losses. He was going to walk away. "Mr. Pike," I called out, my voice sharp. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. "You're forgetting something," I said. "The audio tape implicates Delia, but I also have the original purchase order for those surplus-grade valves, the one with W. Halbert's signature on the receiving line. A document like that. I imagine the state attorney would find that very interesting. It suggests a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond simple municipal fraud." He stood perfectly still, his back a rigid wall of expensive tailoring. For a long moment, the only sound was the incessant, maddening hum of the fluorescent light. He had built an empire on the fiction of his own integrity, and I had just handed him the bill for its demolition. Slowly, he turned his head, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes were no longer those of a predator, but of a cornered animal. "What do you want?" he asked, the words barely more than a whisper. My answer was not to him. It was to the room, to the humming fluorescent light, to the ghost of my mother, and to the 21 years of interest that had accrued on their debt. I reached into my portfolio and retrieved a slim leather-bound folder. From it, I produced a set of documents, pre-printed, with neat signature lines at the bottom of each page. I had come prepared not for a negotiation, but for a surrender. I placed the first page on the table in front of Victor. "My terms are not complicated," I stated, my voice as cold and flat as the concrete floor. "They are absolute." I began to read, my tone that of a lawyer dictating the articles of a settlement, each condition a hammer blow demolishing the foundations of their world. Stipulation 1. The immediate and permanent dissolution of the charitable entity known as the Haven of Astor. All of its assets, liquid and physical, will be audited by an independent third party of my choosing. Upon completion of the audit, 100% of the remaining assets will be transferred to a newly created, publicly managed trust. The trust will be named the Nora Whitlow Reservoir Restoration Fund. Its sole mandate will be the repair and ongoing maintenance of the reservoir and its surrounding ecosystem. The name Delia's Cove will be stricken from all official town maps and records, effective immediately. Delia made a sound, a choked gasp of outrage, but I did not look at her. I slid the second page across the table. Stipulation 2. Halbert and Pike Consulting will issue a formal public admission of gross professional negligence and ethical misconduct in its consulting work for the town of Coldwater Ridge. The firm will fully indemnify all purchasers of the recent municipal bond issue, refunding their investment at par value plus accrued interest. Furthermore, Halbert and Pike will voluntarily withdraw from all existing contracts with the town and agree to a legally binding 10-year moratorium, during which the firm will not bid on, accept, or participate in any public or private contracts within the county limits. Victor's face was a mask of gray stone. He was watching his regional empire crumble into dust in the space of a single breath. I placed the third page on the table. This one was for Delia. Stipulation 3. Delia Whitlow will tender her immediate resignation from her position as interim town treasurer and from all other public, private, and charitable boards on which she holds a seat. Concurrently, she will sign an irrevocable legal covenant, witnessed by Chief Harris, rescinding any and all claim, present or future, to the assets, properties, and accounts of the Whitlow family estate. She will be granted a monthly stipend, drawn from her personal accounts, sufficient for a modest living. She will not control the family's wealth again. This time, the sound Delia made was a low hiss. I could feel the heat of her hatred from across the room. I ignored it and turned my attention to my stepbrother, who was staring at me with a look of utter disbelief. I laid down the final page. Stipulation 4. Wade Pike will file a full, public disclosure of his conflicts of interest regarding the municipal bond issue. He will plead no contest to a misdemeanor charge of failing to do so previously. In exchange for his cooperation, the district attorney will recommend a sentence of 2 years probation and 500 hours of community service. That community service will be fulfilled by performing manual labor on the reservoir restoration project, under the supervision of the new trust's foreman. I looked up from the documents and met Victor Pike's deadened eyes. "These are the terms," I said. "They are not negotiable. You will sign these agreements tonight, here, with Chief Harris as witness. In return for your full and immediate compliance, the audio recording and the purchase order signed by your predecessor will remain with my attorney, held in escrow, and will not be forwarded to the State Attorney General for criminal prosecution. You will save yourselves from prison. You will not, however, save yourselves from the consequences. Silence, the hum of the light, the faint, distant sound of a passing car on the street above. Victor Pike, the man who had built a career on calculated risks, was staring at the abyss. He could fight, and in doing so, he would lose everything and go to jail, or he could sign and lose almost everything, but walk away a free, ruined man. His choice was purely mathematical. He looked at Delia, a long, hard look, devoid of any affection. It was the look of a man assessing a liability. Then he looked at his son, whose arrogant posture had collapsed into a frightened slump. Finally, his eyes came back to the papers on the table. He reached for the pen I had placed there. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he signed the first page, his signature a jagged, angry scar on the paper. He signed the next, and the next, pushing each one aside as he completed it, a full confession and surrender, notarized by the scratch of a pen on paper. When all the documents were signed, I gathered them into my folder. The deal was done. The machine was now in motion. "There's one final detail," I said, my voice cutting the tense silence. "There will be a public press conference. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., on the steps of the town hall. You, Mr. Pike, and you, Delia, will be in attendance. You will announce these voluntary actions yourselves." Delia finally found her voice. It was a low, shaking whisper, filled with a desperate, manipulative plea. "You can't," she said, looking at me, but her words were meant for a different audience. "Rowan, you can't do this to your father. Think of his shame. Think of his place in this town." It was her last move, her last attempt to use my father as a human shield, the same shield she had hidden behind for 21 years. I met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not doing this to my father," I replied, my voice cold and precise. "I'm doing this for the truth. He is merely a bystander to it, as he has always been." As the words left my mouth, a movement at the door caught my eye. The heavy fire door was slightly ajar. Standing in the shadows of the hallway just beyond was my father. He must have been listening the entire time. His face was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. Then, a single, broken whisper escaped his lips. "Rowan, I'm sorry." The words were a lifetime too late. A single drop of rain on a raging fire. Delia looked toward him, her face contorting in a last appeal. Wade wouldn't look at him at all. Victor Pike just stared at the signed papers, a man already living in the ruins of his life. My father took a hesitant step toward me, his arms slightly raised as if he might try to embrace me. I did not move toward him. I did not offer a word of comfort or forgiveness. The time for that had passed 2 decades ago. Instead, I opened my folder one last time, to the document establishing the new trust. I took my pen, not to sign, but to point. I placed the tip of it directly on the letterhead, tapping the heavy paper twice. I tapped the name, Nora. That was my answer. I didn't need to say another word. The sun at noon was a white, merciless eye in the sky. It bleached the color from the town hall steps and cast sharp, unforgiving shadows. The wind, sweeping in from the west, carried the clean, cold scent of the reservoir. No longer a place of sorrow, but a place of reckoning. They had all come. The town square was a sea of faces, a silent, expectant crowd packed onto the lawn and spilling into the street. There were reporters with cameras poised like scavenger birds, Halberd and Pike employees in funereal business attire, and the people of Coldwater Ridge, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and a dawning, terrible understanding. A podium had been set up on the top step, bristling with microphones. I walked to it alone. Behind me, positioned like statues in a tragedy, stood Victor Pike and Delia. He looked like a man who had aged a decade overnight. She, impossibly, looked the same, her face a mask of serene composure, her hands clasped in front of her, but it was the composure of a marble effigy, cold and brittle, about to crack. I did not have a long speech. I had a statement of fact. I leaned into the microphones, the sudden amplification of my breath a sharp, rushing sound. I let the silence hang for a moment, drawing every eye. "The reservoir will have its name back," I said, my voice clear and steady, each word a stone dropping into a deep well. "And so will our history." I stepped back. That was all. I had presented the finding. Now, the debtors would present their payment. Victor Pike moved to the podium as if wading through deep water. He avoided looking at the crowd, his eyes fixed on the prepared statement in his trembling hands. He began to read in a monotone, the words stripped of his usual commanding baritone. He spoke of serious professional misjudgments, of a failure to uphold the highest ethical standards, and a deeply regrettable series of errors. He announced that Halbert and Pike would be making full financial restitution to the town and its investors. He concluded by announcing the firm's immediate and total withdrawal from all business activities in the county. Then, he did something I hadn't expected. He looked up, directly into the cluster of camera lenses, and he bowed his head. It was not a nod of contrition, it was a formal, complete bow of surrender. The cameras flashed in a blinding, percussive frenzy, a final brutal sunset for the legacy of Halbert and Pike in Coldwater Ridge. He shuffled away from the podium, a ghost in a $1,000 suit. Now it was Delia's turn. She glided to the microphones, a portrait of wronged dignity. She arranged the pages of her own statement. Though she never looked at them, her eyes swept the crowd, and a small, pained smile touched her lips. She was about to perform, to cast herself as the victim, the misunderstood public servant caught in a tragic family drama. "My friends, my neighbors," she began, her voice resonating with a practiced, heartfelt sorrow. "There has been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding." She never finished the sentence. A sound crackled to life, not from the podium's microphones, but from the large public address horns mounted on the facade of the town hall itself. It was the sound of static, then a woman's voice, sharp with anger, echoing across the sun-drenched square. "Immoral, and you know it is." It was my mother's voice, a ghost broadcast from the past. The crowd murmured, confused. Delia froze, her mouth slightly open, her face a canvas of pure disbelief. Then, her own voice answered from the speakers, 21 years younger, dripping with condescending dismissal. "You're being dramatic. It's a cost-saving measure." The recording played on, the entire, damning conversation, broadcast in high fidelity for the entire town to hear, the argument about drainage routes, the reckless disregard for safety, the casual laugh about insurance, the truth, stripped of all pretense, echoed off the brick buildings and settled over the crowd like a shroud. Delia stood motionless at the podium, trapped in the spotlight, being crucified by her own words. She was being slapped, over and over, by a voice no one could see. The final blows were not delivered by my hand, but by her own history. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. No one moved. Delia slowly lowered her head, her statement fluttering from her numb fingers and drifting to the steps at her feet. In the stunned aftermath, 2 quiet acts of surrender took place. To the side of the steps, a table had been set up with a clipboard for volunteers for the new restoration fund. I watched as Wade, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the ground, walked to the table, picked up the pen, and signed his name to the list. He was the first volunteer, a small, silent act of penance to begin a long, public atonement. And at the far edge of the crowd, leaning against an old oak tree, was my father. He stood alone, a solitary figure lost in the sea of faces. No one looked at him, no one spoke to him. All the attention, All the whispered comments and shocked stares were directed at the figures on the steps. For the first time in his life, Grant Whitlow was completely, utterly invisible. He was an irrelevant footnote in a story that had, until this moment, revolved entirely around him. He was finally tasting the cold, airless existence that had been my own for 21 years. As if on cue, a truck from the town's public works department pulled up to the curb by the reservoir park. Two men got out, carrying a large, new sign. With a few quick movements, they unbolted the old familiar Delia's Cove sign and set it on the grass like a tombstone. They hoisted the new one into place. The letters were a deep forest green against a cream-colored background. "The Nora Whitlow Restoration Fund," it read, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "Funded by restitution payments from Halberd and Pike Consulting." A smattering of applause started in the crowd. It was hesitant at first, then grew stronger, spreading through the square. They weren't clapping for me. I was just the messenger, the auditor who had delivered the final report. They were clapping for the name on the sign. They were clapping for a piece of their town's history, stolen and now returned to its rightful place. They were clapping for Nora. I folded the single sheet of paper that held my 2-sentence speech and slipped it into my pocket. My work here was done. The audit was complete. The findings presented. The corrections entered into the public ledger. I turned away from the podium and the microphones. My job finished. It felt no different from closing a file at the end of a long, arduous shift. I drove back to the house on Astor Hill one last time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, making the peeling paint and sagging porch look even more skeletal than before. The house was no longer a place of menace. It was just a sad, empty shell, a crime scene that had been processed and cleared. I walked through the unlocked front door. The air inside was still and stale, holding its breath. In the living room, on the mantelpiece where Delia's porcelain figurines once stood, I had placed the few things from my mother's hope chest: a faded photograph of her smiling by the reservoir, a small, worn book of poetry, and the unfinished letter. They were no longer hidden away in an attic. They were home. She was sitting on the front steps, her back to me. Delia. She looked small and frail, stripped of her power and her public armor. The navy blue suit she had worn to the press conference was rumpled, her perfect coiffure slightly undone. Her hands, which had once commanded rooms and signed away fortunes, were trembling in her lap. She must have heard my footsteps on the hardwood floor, but she didn't turn around. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said, her voice a dry, rustling whisper, barely carried on the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. I stopped in the doorway, the screen door separating us like a confessional grill. "I didn't come back," I replied, my voice devoid of triumph or malice. It was simply a statement of fact, the final entry in a ledger. I saw it through to the end. She had nothing to say to that. The truth was a language she had never learned to speak, and now it was the only one left. My father appeared from the hallway, a ghost in his own home. His eyes were red, his face a roadmap of grief and shame. He looked from Delia's broken form on the steps to me, standing in the doorway, and his mouth worked, struggling to form words of apology, of explanation, of regret. He wanted to build a bridge across the 21 years of silence and complicity. He wanted absolution. I would not give it to him. Words were useless now. They were the currency of his wife's lies, the flimsy material from which he'd built his prison of denial. Instead, I reached into my portfolio and took out a single, clean document. I stepped past Delia, careful not to touch her, and walked over to my father. I didn't hand it to him. I held it out for him to take. It was a copy of the charter for the new restoration fund. He took it, his hands shaking as much as Delia's. His eyes scanned the page, but I knew he saw only one thing: the name at the top of the page, in bold, official type. His first wife's name, my mother's name. That was my final statement. His penance would not be to earn my forgiveness. It would be to live with her memory, finally unobscured. for the rest of his days. I turned and walked to the old oak dining table, the site of my welcome home beating. I reached into my pocket and took out the front door key. It was not the old, worn brass key of my mother's car. That was in a safe deposit box. Its work done. This was the key to the house itself, the one my father had mailed to me a week ago. I placed it in the center of the polished table, where my mother's key had lain. The object I had carried in with me was the object I would leave behind. My access was revoked, by my own hand. I walked out of the house and did not look back. My car was waiting in the driveway. In the trunk, in a locked briefcase, was the closed file on the Coldwater Ridge case, the audit logs, the audio files, the financial analyses, the receipts, the signed confessions, all of it, a neat and tidy record of a ruinous truth. Everything had been submitted. The case was closed. I started the engine, the sound unnaturally loud in the afternoon stillness. I pulled out of the long gravel driveway and turned onto the main road, the road that led away from Astor Hill, away from the town, the road that ran alongside the reservoir. I drove slowly, my window down. The water was a brilliant, impossible blue under the autumn sun. The surface ruffled by the same wind that had blown through the town square that morning, and there it was, the new sign, freshly installed, its green and cream colors bright and clean. The Nora Whitlow Restoration Fund. Her name, solid and real, anchored to the place she had loved. It glittered in the sun, a small, quiet beacon of victory. As I watched it, my phone, sitting on the passenger seat, buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was an email from my brokerage firm. The subject line read, "Transaction Confirmation." The body of the email was brief. It was a notification that the full restitution for the municipal bonds I had purchased had been wired to my account. The final transaction. The last piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I reached over and tapped the screen, archiving the message. An auditor's work was never done until the final reconciliation was complete. I clicked the virtual button on my project management app. Mark as complete. I pressed my foot on the accelerator. The car picked up speed. The sign shrinking in the distance. The road curved ahead, leading out of the valley, toward the highway, toward the rest of my life. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was no need. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below, and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like, and to help this story reach more people. You can give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.